So welcome everyone to the Childcare Now webinar on what government must do to improve wages, benefits, and pensions in the childcare sector. So our main objective today is to present some key recommendations on these matters from the National Early Learning and Childcare Workforce Policy Table, as well as to hear from you. And if you're not familiar with what the policy table is, don't worry, we will go over that in our presentation. So my name is Te. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the Policy and Outreach Coordinator at Childcare Now's Educators Matter project. I'm co-hosting today's webinar with my colleague, Rachel Vickerson, who is the Policy and Project Manager. So I would like to open the space in an intentional and good way with a land acknowledgement on behalf of Childcare Now. Childcare Now's office is located on the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, but our organization is active on the lands ceded, unceded, and contested across Turtle Island. As a national advocacy organization, Childcare Now respects and affirms the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands and waters with whom we strive to work in solidarity. Childcare Now commits to the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. We note in particular call number 12, which calls upon all governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Indigenous families. So what this means to our session tonight is that we encourage you to interact with the intention to support Indigenous communities, children, families, and particularly educators as we talk about wages, benefits, and pensions for the childcare workforce in Canada. And now I'm going to invite Rachel to give us a quick overview of the agenda.
Thanks, Ta. So I'm going to quickly go over the agenda. That will be doing a very short project overview, talking with the current context for the workforce in Canada. We're going to talk about what the policy recommendations are, and then have a few moments for questions and answers, and then a breakout group discussion before a report back. It's a busy agenda for just 1 hour, especially well, for some of us later at night. So we will try to keep things moving, keep you awake, and also know that this is just the beginning of sort of these discussions. There's a lot of material in the document itself, which we encourage you to read. And I'm going to be posting links in the chat as well with that information. Back to you, Ta.
Thanks, Rachel. So before getting into the recommendations and everything, I would like to give you a very short introduction on the Educators Matter project. So this is a 3-year project from 2023 to 2026 at Childcare Now that aim at advancing collective knowledge on the Canada childcare workforce. So our focus is on developing policy solutions for the retention and recruitment crisis, and ultimately to support the implementation of the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, or you may have heard it as CWELC, or the 10-a-day childcare system. So more specifically, our team conduct background research related to the workforce and engage with the sector to understand more comprehensively what we mean when we say that early childhood educators and childcare workers need better wages and working conditions, and how we can together achieve that goal. And beside policy research, we also provide support to ally organizations and groups in Canada who may be working on the same research and advocacy work related to the workforce. And our work is guided by the National Early Learning and Childcare Workforce Policy Table, including an advisory committee. So we convened this policy table with an objective to have consistent and regular mechanism, way to engage with people who work in the sector in order to learn from them about what happens on the ground and to have their voices in shaping these policy recommendations that we put out as part of this project. So, this policy table is made up of individuals with diverse roles and experiences in the sector, including those who work directly with children and families, and those who work directly with educators, childcare workers, operators, as well as ECE students. So, you can have a look at the full list of the policy table members and who they are on our website. So Rachel and I work closely with this table to develop policy recommendations on various topics related to the workforce. And wages, benefits, and pensions are the focus of our first set of policy recommendations that we are really thrilled to share with you today. And I'm gonna so these
Oh, I can
are,
take it.
yeah, these are the two publications that we have released so far as part of this project. The first one on your left is a summary of workforce policies as of December 2023 under the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare System. This will give you an overall look of the policies that were in place. And then the second publication is Wages, Benefits, and Pension Recommendations from the Policy Table, which we are going to talk about more tonight. And you can access both of these publications on our website as well.
Sorry, our PowerPoint is so advanced that it
That's
clicked
okay. I
the.
did put the link in there. So when you have the
Okay,
slides, you can actually click on it and access the
wow, so
reports,
fancy. Okay, hang on a
which
second. Now I
Rachel
have to
just
get this
did.
back.
That's okay.
Here we go. I'm so impressed. Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And over to you,
Um,
Rachel.
Thank you. So a big part of this project and the idea of having a national policy table is that even though there are still many differences in how the $10 a day childcare plan is rolling out across different provinces and territories, we also know that there is many commonalities and shared issues and shared growth and strengths that have come out of this $10 a day childcare plan. When we talk about advancing workforce policy solutions, it's useful to think first about where we're at and how every province and territory is at a different place on this pathway, and there's strengths and challenges that are unique to each jurisdiction, but at the same time, there's a lot that is similar. And one thing that's really helpful, we had a webinar earlier today where we had people from all across the country, and just learning and hearing about people's experiences in different provinces and territories is something we don't get to do enough of in childcare because there's so much work that happens provincially or territorial. So with that being said, one of the major changes in terms of where wages are at since the beginning of $10 a day childcare is the implementation of wage grids in many provinces and territories. A wage grid, in this case, we used a pretty loose definition of it to mean, any sort of grid with a y-axis and an x-axis that has different levels of early childhood educator in different roles. With experience levels, but we know that some of these wage grids are not as advanced as we would like them to be. They may be too simplistic, or in the case of Manitoba, they're not mandatory, so they don't actually necessarily have guaranteed funding attached to them. And that's not the kind of wage grid we want, but I'm jumping ahead a little bit to policy recommendations there. But I think it's still really worth noticing that there are many provinces and territories that did not have a wage grid before the beginning of the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system, and now do. There's also other provinces that have committed to them, and territories, BC, Saskatchewan, and Yukon. But we also have provinces and territories that don't yet have any commitment to have wage grids. Similarly, with pensions, this is a really key issue for the workforce, the need for pensions and extended health and dental benefits. We see that under the Canada-wide $10 a day plan, there has been some really exciting developments in some places. So in Nova Scotia, the introduction of a defined benefit pension plan and an extended health and dental plan. In Prince Edward Island, the introduction of a defined contribution pension plan, and in Newfoundland and Labrador, an extended health plan. There's also a few other provinces that have pension and retirement supports or benefit supports, such as Yukon, Manitoba, and Quebec has had this for quite a long time in their funded services. But we've seen that there is an introduction of some of these new programs made possible with the $10 a day plan. So what's working? We know that for the first time, wage grids have been implemented widely across the country, which brings wider transparency and stability to the sector. There's been some real gains in pension benefits coverage in some places. And there's been significant increases in funding for post-secondary education and professional development, which makes EC training and higher pay more accessible across the country. So a lot of these wage grids, a wage grid will pay more for higher levels of ECE. So we want to make sure that that's equitable and that's accessible for all. And then the last point here is a bit different, but I think it's really important to think about, because when we talk about any of these changes and what's possible, we know that recruitment and retention and educator wages have been an issue for a really long time in Canada. This is not a new issue. Yes, there's no more demand for $10 a day childcare, but ECEs have been underpaid, undervalued many places across the country for many, many years. But for a long time, any sort of increase in educator wages had to be on the backs of parents. It had to be up the parent fees so that the ECs could get paid more. But with this new federal public funding, it means that the majority of ECE wages and of our center's budget is now coming from this public funding, both provincial or territorial, and federal funding, which is new. That means that we can improve wages and improve working conditions without increasing parent fees. This is a really big change in how we think about this and what's possible. And I think this is really worth talking about, because all of our recommendations are based on a foundational understanding that this is all of this requires enough public funding to make this happen, and that that's possible. So as I said, there's still some areas that still need some more work. Many wage grids that have come in place still fail to compensate educators sufficiently for their education, their experience, and their skills. The rates are often too low, especially when you compare them to other sectors that ECs are going to work in. Another issue is that there's no requirement to co-develop these wage grids or these frameworks or supplements with the sector themselves. So ECs are hearing, oh, this is my wage grid, and that's just what I'm getting paid now. And that is very different than how it works in many other sectors that also are publicly funded, or majority public funded, the way childcare is now. For example, teachers or nurses, there's a mechanism to participate in that setting of wages. It could be in Canada, that's often at the bargaining table through unions, but we see other places and other mechanisms that exist too. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that specific process, but a democratic process to have a say and have that be built into the design is really missing. And that's something that is really important to us as a project that is about educator voices. There's not a formal sort of review process and evaluation that's publicly available for how this is all working in terms of wages across the country. And as I mentioned before, even though there's been some gains in pensions and benefits, most jurisdictions don't have a commitment to implement. a pensions and benefits plan. I should say also there's a bit of time for questions, so we will answer those after if we haven't answered them in the chat. So the recommendations put forward by the policy table are quite detailed. This is a very kind of overview level document, but I really encourage you to read the entire recommendations, which were sent out in an email before, and they're available on our website as well. Because they are meant to go into a further level of detail about what is needed in the sector. And these are just kind of the high level areas. I'll try to talk about them a little bit right now. So part of the recommendations focus on fair and equitable principles for setting wages, that these should be competitive with other sectors. They should value ECEs for their education and their qualifications and their skills, and that they should be principles that are applied transparently and equitably across the whole sector. We think that there needs to be enough public funding to support wages, and that wage grids and wage formulas are integrated into a center's budget. It's not an add-on or a separate thing you have to apply for. It's that is a key part of quality and a key part of a center's budget. As I just talked about, there needs to be formalized processes for the sector to be involved in determining wages. This feels really new for childcare. This isn't something we have. Most of the sector, for example, isn't unionized, or there's associations, but they're voluntary. So there's still, not necessarily a process to do this. And we recommend at this point to just explore what those processes would be, and to start developing them. We don't go into specific detail about what that exact process is because it is really new, but we also know it's really important when we're designing the system. That we need to integrate wage grids with other policies regarding scope of practice, qualification recognition, and equitable access to education. The wage grids are only as good as the sort of different levels and how we recognize that, what education credentials we value, how we value Indigenous knowledges, how we value, who gets access to being a level 3 ECE, for example. So any work that has to do with wage grids needs to understand that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, but exists in the scope of all these other contexts of, how educators work and how they practice. We think there should be strong evaluation and accountability mechanisms at both the provincial and territorial level and the federal level. And really importantly, that there should be robust, and that means a lot, good federal funding allocations and guidelines that facilitate recruitment and retention of the workforce in provinces and territories. And that's federal funding. So we've seen a really great infusion of federal funding to the provinces and territories, a lot of which has gone towards bringing down parent fees, which is super important. But we think that there should be more federal funding and that it should be targeted now specifically at supporting the workforce. I'm not going to go into this, so I'll send these slides out. This just goes into more detail about what we mean when we talk about fair and equitable principles, and the federal role. One more thing to highlight here in the federal role is that we also are looking to seek that the provincial and territorial governments match the federal contributions and also support the ELCC workforce. It's really important to have federal funding to develop this Canada-wide system, and to have federal agreements that support provinces and territories to put in wage grids, pensions, and benefits. But we also know that we need to advocate to our provincial and territorial governments for their own contributions for the workforce, especially for all those educators that aren't covered under Canada-wide programs, for example, school-age educators.
Thanks, Rachel. And next, we're going to move on to some of the key recommendations in terms of benefits and pensions. So really what we believe here and what we recommend here is that there needs to be a structure so that pension and benefit plans can cover fully and equitably the childcare workforce. And we believe that all of those who work in the childcare sector should have access to these essential support, especially because right now, most of them don't have access to these support. And having um, benefits and pensions can really be the only way for many to afford healthcare and retirements. Um, and we don't have it on here specifically, but I got a question in the chat about home childcare providers. And I want to say it again here that we believe home childcare providers should also have access to benefits and pensions. And because they don't usually have these through an employer, um, like in center-based programs, we need to explore ways that they can get access to these. An example is in PEI in Prince Edward Island and in Nova Scotia. There are grants available for licensed home childcare providers to purchase their own health and dental benefits. So those are the possibilities that we want to see more and think about more so that everyone will have access to benefits and pensions. And what we emphasize here is that these supports shouldn't be at the expense of the centers itself, of the programs itself, but funded publicly by the governments. And that there also should be a national standards and guidelines to ensure that no matter where you are located in Canada, you can have access to benefits and pensions equitably. And I think we can move on to the key themes.
Thanks, Ta. So these are a few points that are, they weren't necessarily in the recommendations written out just like this, but I think that they really guided a lot of our thinking about the recommendations. And I think they're just important to highlight here now. So one of them is that system building takes time. So we know that the Canada-wide early learning and childcare system is very new. It's 2 years, 2.5 years old. There's been a lot of changes in that time. We've seen huge cuts to parent fees across the country. But we also know that there's a lot more work to do and a lot of challenges that are still existing. And we need to get the design right from the beginning of building this new national program that's going to last for generations. And that means that we need to support educators and have policies that support educators from the beginning and from the onset of this huge national program that we're developing. And that's where these recommendations come in. This idea that we need to have really specific implementation standards for how wages are thought about, how working conditions and benefits and pensions are thought about as key to quality, key to expansion, and key to the $10 a day system as a whole, as well as key to people's lives and key to the experience of educators in jobs that they care about and are passionate about. We also want to recognize that all areas of workforce policy are interconnected. So these recommendations, we tried to really focus in on wages, pensions, and benefits, like the real kind of money focused ones, which we know are really important and not to be discounted, but that also the wages, pensions, and benefits interact with working conditions, with regulations, with what level of ECE you are, if you're at a province that has different levels, and how that's felt, how that's lived, and your experience of workforce policies is not single issue, but interconnected. The other thing I just want to say, and I said this at the beginning as well, is that every province and territory is at a different place in their $10 a day system building. We see some really exciting things happening. I talked about the defined benefit pension plan in Nova Scotia, for example, but there's also lots of areas of growth everywhere as well. The idea here with national recommendations put forward by a policy table that does represent those in the sector across the country is that these recommendations can help move us all forward and help provincial and territorial advocacy, as well as advocacy to the federal government. But that they're not going to alone do the job. Recommendations are a really helpful base, but they need to be brought forward and brought to life by advocacy, which is a key part of what Child Care Now's mission is, and something that needs to happen at the provincial, territorial, and local level. And I think that's actually it for sort of the formal presentation, but I was wondering if anyone had any questions specifically about the recommendations before we get into breakout groups. Tuck and circulate them.
Um, I think the questions, we have two questions in the chat, but they're already addressed.
Okay, yeah, I see there's some questions in the chat about home childcare, which you were chatting about.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think oh, I also see another comment here actually from Sharon, that, having a pilot program as BC does, it's just a wage floor that's not actually a grid with multiple steps, isn't really a wage grid. And I think
Mm,
that's something that we've actually seen. Manitoba, again, it had for a long time a wage grid that was really just a starting point and a target wage, not really a wage grid. Um, and what we really are advocating for is not a wage grid in name only, but a real system that shows long-term progression as you continue through your EC career, as you continue,
mhm.
increasing your level, increasing your qualifications, and getting compensated and recognized for that. So that's the kind of wage grid we're talking about here, the way there are in many other public sectors.
Absolutely.
Um, so I just see,
I think this one question just popped up
mhm.
from Jelena, uh, asking if the plan is to help BC workers receive more funding, including a pension plan, a retirement plan, etc.
Thanks. Yeah, so this project is both a research project and an advocacy project. It's put on by, Child Care Now. We're a national advocacy association organization advocating for affordable and accessible childcare for all. Um, and in that, we understand that the research is important and the research has to be brought in with advocacy. So these recommendations in this kind of report is meant to guide that work. And we do that work in a number of different ways. We just had 10 days of action for $10 a day childcare. So one example could be this could be the kind of report that you're bringing up if you meet with your member of parliament and you say, I want, or you're a member of legislative assembly or your
Mhm.
MPP, that you're saying this is what we need to move towards. I believe educators are important, and here's some recommendations to back that up. I just see another
Thanks,
question
Rachel.
from Breeze. Um, so, do these recommendations also go to treaty-owned land like reserves, for example, who lack a lot of childcare? Um, so in these recommendations, uh, we do specifically state that we support the right for self-determination for Indigenous peoples to govern their own workforce policy on these lands. But we also recognize the need for federal funding and to use our place and our privilege to advocate for equitable and not equal, but equitable, recognizing the lack of funding on
Mhm.
these lands for many years, continuing on today. So we do advocate that there needs to be significant federal funding to go towards treaty-owned lands, but that we are not the policy table in a position to make further recommendations on that.
Mhm. Thanks,
Um,
Rachel. We have a few questions.
okay.
So one from Jill, has this wage grid been discussed in Alberta at all?
Yeah, so in Alberta, we there isn't a wage grid right now. There's some groups that sit on the policy table and also are very involved in advocacy at a provincial level there. So I would, I would say that it's very in close connection to the advocacy that's happening in Alberta. Um, and that this document, I would say, very much supports some other documents and resources that have come out of Alberta, like the Roadmap for Quality Childcare, the Mootart Foundation, as well as a very recent study that they had also done with the Association in Alberta of ECEs on working
Mhm.
conditions. So um, again, that's where that provincial advocacy piece comes in.
Right. I think I'm gonna say these two questions and then we're gonna bring people to breakout groups in the interest of time. So one question from Jelena. What about the for-profit agencies and how will the government support any for-profit agencies or center owners?
Yeah, so these recommendations are for any center that is getting $10 a day childcare funding, and that they would apply equally to all programs, for profit, nonprofit, public programs, that we think that they should all be under the same sort of funding formulas that provide good working conditions and wages and benefits for their staff, and that is backed up by strong public accountability mechanisms to ensure that that's where that funding is going. And that I think all the wage grids so far that have kind of come into place, that's how they've worked. They've been for any center that is enrolled in the $10 a day program.
Yeah, and I think the goal is exactly to make sure that no matter what programs people work in, they have access to decent wages, benefits, and pension. Um,
Exactly. Like if they're getting federal money and they're getting
yeah.
publicly funded for their wages, then we need to have
Hmm.
this kind of public sector standards.
Yeah. Uh, Last question from Elsa. Is there any talks about ECEs joining the Union of Teachers in the near future?
Yeah, this is certainly a question we get a lot is sort of what is the future in terms of unionization in the
Hmm.
sector. I think it's something that's worth exploring. I think it's something that's kind of different in each province and territory. I don't know if the answer personally is joining teachers or another sort of form of labor organizing. Um, but I think it's worth talking about that and discussing it in our local communities,
Hmm.
um, because we do know that there has been there's a need for a mechanism for ECEs to have a say in their wages and their working conditions, and this is one possibility for that.
Amazing. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, I think
Okay, I'm going to quickly go to the next slide before
yes.
I stop sharing. Um, which is really just that we're going to have short breakout groups, and Ted's going to explain a little bit more. Um, oh yes, I should also. That's a good point, Janice. There's also the recommendations from the association in Alberta. Um, sorry, I got distracted. Um,
No worries.
we're going to have quick breakout groups, and they're just going to talk. Just to have hear from you about if the presentation reflected your experience and knowledge of the sector, what resonated with you in your own jurisdiction, um, what parts would you like to hear more about, which parts are you still curious about or have some questions. Um, so just an opportunity to chat. Tara, is there anything else to say there?
Yeah, so just logistics wise, we'll have four relatively big group from 20 to 25 people. And we encourage each room to maybe have one person, if you can volunteer, to maybe have a very short report back at the end of the breakout group. Just, like capture generally what your group was talking about. That would be really helpful. We do have our people in some of the groups, but not all of them because we are a little bit short-staffed tonight. Um, yeah, so. I already
Yeah.
assigned groups for everyone, and you will see a
And just quickly, I'll
notification
say,
shortly.
oh,
Oh, sorry, Rachel, go
Um,
ahead.
one, sorry, I started talking. I just wanted to also say, because we do have folks from all across the country with different perspectives, And let's just all remember to come into these conversations curious about what others' experiences have been, and
Mhm.
interesting and respectful as well, as we talk. And it would be helpful if people, when they go in their groups and they're chatting, to just say where you're from, because I think that's always a fun part of this as well.
Yeah, very good point. Okay.
So again, the question is just, did this presentation reflect your experience and knowledge of the sector? And we have about 15 minutes.
Yeah, we'll have 15 minutes in our breakout groups. And I'll open the rooms right now. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, we have 5 minutes left with each other. So we're gonna do a very quick report back. I would love to hear how the conversation went in the group. Rachel, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I feel like we had some really good conversation in our group, and I have this kind of 2 points I think that are that I want to really bring out. The first one is we had a few people who were day home or home childcare providers in our group, um, and they talked about some real challenges that they've experienced in that role, not having employee status and not having benefits or a pension, or wages that have kept pace with inflation, because they're at a set fee, and that they don't have access to any sort of wage grid, and that they also don't have access to employment insurance or EI, which is an important point to highlight that we didn't before. And I think just all these points spoke to a need to better integrate home child care providers in the important work they do, and make sure that they have equitable labor protections and benefits. The other point, quickly, I'll mention, um, is that and I think this is something that maybe was lost a bit in my first bit, but it's really important to highlight, that ultimately this is all about creating caring spaces for children, and education and care being integrated, and that this is work that we're doing first and foremost for children and families, and that high quality um, care has to be at the center for all the work we're doing. Um, it's a service for families, it's accessible, it's, where the centers are, it's all those kind of policy questions. But at the heart of this, people don't get into this work because they want to contribute a certain amount to the GDP and the economy. They get into this work to care for children and their families and communities, and that we have to remember that uh, a lot of our work must come back to that, and that any sort of discussion about our wages, policy, benefits, working conditions, should have that at the center too. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, really great discussion. And sorry, I took more time than I thought, but I'll
That's
pass it
okay.
over to Alana.
Yeah, sure. Our group is also eager to chat, which was lovely. And two people reconnected. They hadn't seen each other since they did their post-secondary and now live in different parts of the country. So how fun is that? But we talked a lot about wages being like the primary issue for both recruitment and retention, and how folks are seeing that sort of no matter where they are. We talked about how nice it would be to see sort of more pan-Canadian consistency, and we talked about some of the good things that are happening, which is great. And we also talked a bit about our responsibility as treaty people and how we understand, maybe the recommendations we're making here should be also, experienced and lived in First Nations communities too. And I think that that was an important contribution to the conversation. So I thought I'd share that too.
Thanks, Alana. I know that we have two other groups. I wonder if anyone would like to share some key points of discussion in their group.
I
Jill, I
can
saw
go
your
for
hand.
my group.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Jennifer Fox. Our group had a lot of people from Alberta, actually, and a lot of people centered in Calgary, and a lot of people wondering what that is going to look like in Alberta because they haven't really, jumped onto this wage grid thing. But mostly the group was just talking about how there's this sector-wide exhaustion and that wages won't necessarily fix that. Several people talked about the need for more time off and the need for rest and the need for professional development, and that wage grids are great, but we also need to really address that part. And then there was also a question about this robust funding recommendation, like where is that going to come from and who's responsible for kind of seeking out that funding in a political environment where increased taxes are not really a viable option. So who is working on that piece to find those big pots of money that are so desperately needed?
Thanks, Jennifer. And I should just quickly say that I think that point about that it's not just about wages. Obviously, wages are important, but the working conditions are so important too, is something that we 100% agree with. And our next sort of year of the policy table is all focused on different areas within working conditions and advancing recommendations on that. So stay tuned for more news and more ways to be involved. And I think there's one other group. Is there someone from the group that hasn't spoken yet? Jill, is that your group?
Yeah, that was my group. We were mostly BC and Calgary. I think we mostly spoke about the wages being unfair because we don't have a wage grid. I know in Alberta we have nothing here. And so some people are getting, like, there's a $400 discrepancy between a lot of children. You know, in the same area, I could be getting $800 per child while the lady across the street is getting $1,200 for the same services. And we really need to do something about that. And pensions and benefits was another thing we talked about. You know, we pay CPP at the end of the year. And if we want any kind of pension or medical benefit, dental, we need to take it out of our own pocket. I pay $400 a month out of my own pocket to have dental and medical. I don't know why, because at the end of the day, when I need to go see a doctor, I have to make an appointment on the weekend because I don't get any vacation days. So that's another thing. We don't get time off. If we do professional development, it's offered through our agency, and that's on a Saturday. So we're taking one of our weekend days to work again. We usually end up paying for it to do it because they don't provide it for free most of the time. And like I said, that's another day that we're just working. So instead of being offered, you know, 2 days a year in February or 2 days in August, like teachers get for professional development, we get nothing unless we do it on our own time. And I think another point that we made was when the government froze our wages, we didn't really get a warning, and it's been frozen now for a couple of years. Groceries have doubled. We're still expected to feed the children, you know, 3 hot meals a day, nutritious Canada Food Guide meals, but we don't get anything for that. Groceries have doubled, yet our wages have stayed the same.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Jill. And similar themes came up in my group as well with day home providers. That does sound really challenging. And I think that, I mean, I said this in my group too, but it's that we can't forget about when we're making recommendations or advocacy that those working in home child care, day home, it's called different things in different provinces. So I'm trying to use different words, but I hope everyone knows what I mean. That that you can't be forgotten. And I do also want to give a big shout out to, it sounds like there's so many day home providers who've come on this session after the end of their long day working probably alone in their family, in their house with children. And oh my gosh, I'm just really can't believe that you all made it on here. So thank you so much for spending time with us, you know, after such a long day. I really appreciate it. So I've gone a few minutes over time. Is there any other, I can do a little wrap up. Is there anything else you wanted to?
I think, yeah, that's good. That's good.
Okay, you can chime in after if I forget anything.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for coming on this session after your work day. You know, it really means a lot to us that you're interested in hearing about our work, and that we really do want to hear your voices and keep this conversation going. I'm going to put the full recommendations again once more in the chat. And then this link, which looks like a scam link, but it's actually just a subscribe form, is for the Childcare Now newsletter to be updated about any other events we may have. We also encourage you to follow us on social media. As I just mentioned, or maybe this was in my group, we're going to be continuing to talk about working conditions and other areas that affect early childhood educators and childcare workers and providers over the next years of this project. So this is not the end of this conversation, and we're hoping to do more sector engagement and hear from you about what's the most important for you. And I'm going to put one more thing in the chat, which is just our email address, our general email address. If you have any other thoughts that you want to share, it's just info@childcarenow.ca. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Hope you have a great evening.
Yeah. And we'll be following up with the presentation slides from tonight for all of you who came on and registered.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie.
Connie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good night from Manitoba.
Thank you. Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.